I had a radial flyer wagon, not too different from this one. When I grew up, that I pulled around the backyard before I was building mini bikes or customizing cars. And that was really my first ride. And if you've spent much time at automotive swap meets or car shows, you've probably seen some customized wagons. And if you haven't, you could build one and show up there. So I'm gonna start laying this out with what I have in mind. And then I can take what I come up with here and put it in CAD to draw up some parts to have laser cut and have a good solid design so it really turns out how I want it. So what I'm thinking is the rear wheels right about here, but instead of sitting down underneath like they would normally, I want this to sit a little lower. Now some sit down really low with the wheel on the outside, but I want it to sit underneath this lip, kind of like a fender. So I'm gonna prop the wagon up to the height for that. Okay, so that's gonna sit there. On the other side, I'm gonna have the front sit just slightly lower than the back to give just a little bit of a rake angle to it. Now up front, I wanna have a beam like an old Ford, and that's gonna be fabricated out of a bunch of laser cut plates. Now the wheels on the end of that beam I want on actual spindles that can steer, and I'm gonna use some bronze bushings to be able to make that all move nice and smooth. Now I want this whole thing to be rigid and heavy duty, so rather than attaching directly to the wagon bed itself, in this case I'm going to fabricate a whole frame out of some 1-inch square tubing. So that's what I'm thinking for the design. Now that I have some stuff drawn up in CAD, I can go ahead and get on SendCutSend and order my laser cut parts. Now this is really cool if you haven't ever ordered laser cut parts. It's so easy. It's almost like ordering on just Amazon or some online shopping, but you get real custom pieces and they show up pretty quickly, you know, usually within a week for me. Now, if you end up building one of these and you order your parts from SendCutSend, I have a discount code in the description, a link to get one, so you can save 15% off. It's not an affiliate link or anything. It's just an awesome thing they do because they're a great friend of the channel. You know, I could plasma cut these, but the quality is never quite as good in the fit, especially for mechanical parts like this where you're trying to get a nice fit and then run an outside corner joint. The laser cut pieces just work a lot better for that. So we'll come back to those in a minute. First, I need to start off by building the frame, and like most fabrication projects, it starts off with a rectangle out of tubing. So I'm gonna put some miter joints on the corners here and build the base rectangle. And I'm using the fixture table, which is a huge time saver, but if you don't have one, I've fabricated stuff on the floor and on sawhorses for years, so you can totally do it without it, but it is a huge time saver and really nice to have. I need a couple straight cuts for some additional frame members that'll go forward from the wagon bed. And it's always good to just measure and make sure everything's square and clamp it down if you can. But again, the most important thing is really having a good fit and then having a lot of tack welds. And so clamping like this can keep your project from distorting and help keep everything square. But from my experience with this thinner tubing, the 16 gauge, it really doesn't pull that hard and things stay, you know, relatively square as it is. Now, the welding I'm doing is on this Invertig 251 from HTP. They just came out with this and I did a full review on my channel. So if you're in the market for a TIG welder and you're looking for a really nice one, check out that review just a few weeks ago on the channel. It's been pretty impressive for me so far. Now, part of the reason that I'm TIG welding this is just because I can get the welds to lay flush so that when I put the wagon bed on, it'll sit down nice and tight. You could totally build this complete with a MIG welder, but you'd probably need to grind a few welds down flush if you were to MIG weld it. So that's part of the reason. Also, I just like TIG welding, and since this is a fun, more or less hobby project, I, you know, just wanted to do it that way. I designed it so those holes in the wagon bed will line up with the frame members so I can use all the original holes. And so I'm drawing some center lines here to help me line up to mark my holes from the wagon bed. And with it set in place, just get it to a best fit. It lined up pretty good. I was happy with that. Normally I'd just grab the hand drill and run these probably a little later in the process, but since I had the mag drill out anyway, I just using this to drill through. So lining this up with one of the holes in the fixture table is one of the most common ways that I use it. It's really a nice way to use that tool. But again, hand drill would work just fine. It wouldn't take much longer. So these tabs are going to be used for the axle hangers right here. So I've positioned them here at the back of the wagon on the bottom, and I'll weld them in place. And it's nice to have these cut out so I can do the fun part, just focus in on the welding, the actual fitment and fabrication, and that's what I really enjoy. The axle is some 1/2-inch cold rolled steel, and I'll grind a chamfer on it for good measure and then slide it in through those axle hangers that I created already. And this will give a place for the wheels to sit, but I need some way to keep the wheels from coming in too tight against the wagon bed, so I had these little spacers cut out. So I tack welded the axle to those hangers and also to the spacers. Next, I'll fabricate the front axle to go on the frame, and I'll give it a quick wipe down with solvent since I'm TIG welding, but it really isn't too dirty. I'm going to use a new feature on this HTP. It's the fast tack feature. So this uses a programmed pulse to really bridge things together just by tapping the pedal to tack weld things. It was pretty cool. It's different than anything I've tried out before for sure. So I'm tacking them on the inside here on the bottom, and this will just hold everything in place. And there's some tabs on each piece to line it up, so I can use those little tacks to get everything situated, and then I'll sandwich the whole thing together. And here is where that fit really comes in. To have everything snap together like that, it's pretty cool. Now on the other side, I have this outside corner that I'll just tack on the outside and keep my tacks as small as I can. I've sped up the footage where I tacked the outside here, but I'm pausing for long enough for the post flow to keep the tacks clean, because the cleaner the tacks are, the better everything's going to go when I weld over the top of it. I'm welding the butt joints in between the pieces first, and I didn't do any edge prep on these because I'm TIG welding it and I can lay it in pretty flat. If I were to MIG weld this, I would put a slight bevel on each of these just to give some room for the weld to go. Now the outside corners on this were a little bit different from what I'm used to, because I designed this so that the tabs would fill half the joint in one direction or the other, so you have the same amount of material all the way across. Because when I've welded with tabs only in certain places, it's kind of hard, and I thought this would make it consistent, and that worked out. What's different though is the joint's half full already, so you don't have to add as much filler. And since filler helps to cool your weld off, I probably got a little bit hot on this as I went because I didn't have to add very much filler. In fact, I probably could have welded this autogenously or with no filler at all the way along. So it didn't come out to be the very best I've ever welded, but certainly not the worst either. I'll just touch it up with a grinder a little bit and it'll be ready to go. And with a coat of paint, it'll look just fine. In fact, it might add to the sort of hot rod style. Now I'm going to tack this onto the front, and I designed this so the bottom of the beam sits on the same level as the bottom of the frame, so it's pretty easy to line up and go ahead and weld. And once this is welded all the way around, the frame will be done. I get asked all the time for plans for the projects that I build, so I decided to start offering them, and I opened a new website. I'll link in the description, and this will be the first set of plans that you'll be able to log on there and purchase. If you want to build this yourself, it'll have all the laser cut patterns, dimensions, lists of hardware, everything you need to know to be able to replicate this design. With the frame finished, I can move on to the upright assembly. So the spindle will come out of this and it'll allow it to steer. And there are two of them, but I need to make them symmetric or opposite of one another so that they'll work on either side. So go ahead and tack them together in a couple locations here on the sides. Once again, holding some post flow so that I can keep those tacks clean for when I weld over the top of it. So the uprights are finished, and now I need to cut some 1/2-inch cold rolled to go in the holes to create the spindles. The way I'm doing this, I'm going to slide it through to align it and weld on the top surface. And I know this doesn't leave a lot of room for weld, but if I run it hot and leave the reinforcement after, should have enough strength for anything that a wagon's going to be carrying. So I think it'll work okay. Next, I'll turn my attention to a steering arm. So this is another tab and slot fabricated part. It has a space right there for the stock handle for the wagon, a pivot point right in the center, and then a spot for the tie rods to connect. So this upper support will keep everything solid and also has a notch for the handle to be able to fold down over top of the wagon. I think it'll work out pretty well. So this one came out pretty good, but I've got a confession. This was my second attempt. The first one, I actually welded those arms backwards. There's a lot to pay attention to when you're filming and working on a project. I ended up having to take a mulligan on this one. But the second one came out just fine, and I welded that top support on, and it should be ready to go. Now, once again, I need a little axle coming off here, and I'm going to do this in the same way as those spindles. Access is a little bit difficult here, so I can't have ideal torch angles, but honestly, as long as my arc length is pretty short, it doesn't make too big of a difference. It still works out fine. I like flat black for this type of thing, so that's what I'm painting this frame with, and I'm also going to paint those wheel center caps instead of the bright red. Oh, this is the funnest part of the project. All the parts are fabricated. I have the spindles turned out really good. I'm happy with the frame overall. I'm going to start by installing these bronze bearings, and the laser cut plates are close enough on hole size that I can just put them in with a light press. And a light press is pretty nice because I want the shaft to rotate in the center rather than the bearing actually rotating in the hole. Now, in order to press these in, I'm just using a big C-clamp, and this worked just fine for me. It gave plenty of force. If your holes ended up undersized for whatever reason, you might have to file or drill them out to size, but mine were able to run right from the stock cut, so we were good to go on that. Next, I installed the spindles, and I tapped this a little bit to help line them up. They pivot really nice on those bearings, and that's why I think it's worth putting in bearings like this rather than having steel right on steel. I flipped this over so that I can put a retainer on this steering arm. So I had an extra spacer cut in the cut package. This is the same that's on the rear axle, and I want to put a cotter pin through there, so I need to drill a hole. Sometimes it's pretty helpful to file a small flat when you're trying to drill in the side of a round bar. It's not always totally necessary, especially if you're using a split point bit, but it can be pretty helpful. So I did that, and then I'm going to secure it with a cotter pin down there, and it should be able to rotate freely but still hold in place. So I'm real happy with how it's looking, except when the bed's in place, I can't sweep the wheel through the steering motion, so I'm just a little bit short on it. Now, there are a lot of ways that I could fix this, but I'm actually going to just cut that one and extend it so that it'll match my final design. It's always frustrating to cut apart a project when you're almost done with it, but I think this will be a pretty straightforward repair. And the good news is the repair is going to sit underneath the wagon bed, so even if it's not perfect, it won't be all that visible. And it's pretty difficult to get these to line up perfectly when they're welded on both ends. So I'll just do the best I can, and it should work out just fine. So I am loving the style on this. It's looking just like I'd hoped, and now the wheel can sweep through its full range of motion, exactly like I wanted. I updated the plan, so if you pick those up, it'll be up to date with the right length up front, and you should be good to go and benefit from some of my mistakes. Let's get this put together. After trying this out, it pulls great. I'm really happy with how this build turned out. It looks exactly like I was hoping for. I'm excited to use it this summer. Thanks for watching.